Greetings, dear viewers. Today we present to you 3 scary stories related to insanity and psychological disorders. You can learn how life can turn into a real nightmare when your mind starts to fail. Ready to dive into a world of mysticism and horror? Then let's get started. John was a young psychologist who was just beginning his career. He was passionate about his work and regularly received appointments for his patients in a small office. One day he received a strange message from a certain Nikolai, who claimed to be sick and in need of medical help. John decided to see him for an appointment. Nikolai turned out to be a young man suffering from serious mental disorders. He said he had multiple personalities within him, each with their own character and behavior. John began to work with Nikolai and learn more about his condition. One day, after another session, John stayed in his office to work on papers. Suddenly he heard whispering and knocking in the wall. He thought they were strange noises from the next office, but he soon realized they were coming from the wall. He began to talk to Nikolai about it, and he began to say that these were sounds made by one of his personalities. John didn't believe it at first, but he soon began to notice that the sounds were getting louder and more eerie. Finally, he decided to do his best to figure out what was going on in the wall. He started investigating and found out that the office to his right was an abandoned room for the mentally disturbed. He decided to go in there and saw traces of blood on the wall. He began to lose his mind and feared that he too was now a victim of the disease. John heard voices. He began to notice that his thoughts and behavior became increasingly unpredictable. He began to avoid people and felt unable to control his actions. In addition, he began to have nightmares in which he saw creepy and dark scenes. John began to seek help from a therapist, but even after several sessions he did not feel better. He kept hearing voices and experiencing painful visualizations. It seemed that his mental state was only getting worse every day. One day, John woke up in the middle of the night and found himself in someone else's apartment. It was not clear to him how he had gotten there, or what had happened in the last few hours. He felt intense fear and decided to run. Outside, he saw that police officers were already on the scene and proceeding to search the apartment. They found the body of a man John did not know. John was arrested and charged with murder. He could not explain what had happened and claimed he could not remember anything. He was tried and found to be insane. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital indefinitely. Since then, John has spent his days in isolation, suffering from insanity and mental illness. His former life path has been destroyed, and he no longer has any connections to the outside world. He is left alone with his hallucinations and painful memories of the past. There was a young man named Alexander. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Alexander was a very talented and intelligent man, but he had one problem: he suffered from an incurable mental disorder. On the day of his 30th birthday, Alexander began to notice strange things. He felt like someone was watching him and whispering in his ear. He often heard voices that made him do strange things. In addition, his dreams became very vivid and scary. Alexander began to close himself off and refused to communicate with others. He began to go deeper and deeper into his madness. One night he awoke to loud noises coming from behind his bedroom door. He left the room and found the living room door open. Alexander went into the living room and found a huge poster hanging on the wall with his picture on it. At the bottom of the poster was written, "You can't run away from your madness." Alexander was frightened and decided to run away from home. But when he opened the door, standing in front of him was his mother, who had died many years before. she looked at him with a cold and lifeless gaze. Alexander could not understand what was happening and began to scream. After this incident, Alexander was sent to a psychiatric hospital, where he spent the rest of his life. He never understood what happened in his house that night, but he always remained convinced that his insanity caused him to see something unbelievable. Joshua had always been a quiet and reserved person. His parents thought it would pass with time, but when he started college his behavior became even more erratic. He constantly skipped classes, never left his room, and refused to communicate with anyone. One day his roommates heard strange noises coming from his room and decided to call the police. When the police entered the room, they found it empty, but there were strange symbols and words painted on the walls. Joshua was found a few days later in the woods, completely naked and mentally disturbed. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital, where his treatment lasted several years. After his discharge, however, his behavior became even more bizarre. He began to talk about how there was a labyrinth in his head and he could not find a way out. He was constantly spinning around his axis trying to find a way out, and it seemed that his madness was only getting worse. Finally, one night, Joshua disappeared. No one knew where he might have gone. A few days later, however, his body was found in the woods. He was dead, and the same strange symbols had been painted on his body as on the walls of his college room. Now many say that Joshua was afflicted by evil spirits and trapped by his own mind. And his madness proved too strong for him to fight it himself. At the end of the video you can add a reminder that mental disorders can have serious consequences and that you need to seek help from professional psychologists and psychiatrists.